and it's so great to see such a fantastic audience for our speaker tonight. I'm not going to take very much time at all because this entire program was put together by students, and I think they should be front and center to introduce our speaker. I just wanted to just really quickly kind of give a rundown of the logistics of the evening and just sort of explain how things are going to work. First of all, a little context. So the Bellarmine Model United Nations program partners with the World Affairs Council of Tacoma. We've enjoyed that partnership now for 4 or 5 years. I would say it's very mutually beneficial. The World Affairs Council gives our students a lot of opportunities to meet interesting people that do the work that we sort of model. And then on the other hand, we're able to provide venues like this and to host amazing speakers like you're going to hear tonight. And so it really has been a wonderful partnership. We host on our campus typically 3 speakers a year, and 1 per quarter in general. And so if you watch World Affairs Council social media or our own Bellarmine Prep or Bellarmine Model UN social media, you can always find more events on our campus. One of our parts of our mission as a program, Model UN, is to raise awareness, global awareness in our school community and also in our community at large. And so the speakers that we bring in try to, that's sort of our goal with the speakers that we enjoyed having here. So this is about, tonight's about further awareness. Had a chance to talk with our speaker a little bit earlier, and he hopes that people that there's a space for reflection and for acknowledging that we all have something to learn on this topic, and I think it's a great mission for the evening. So what's going to happen is in a second I'm going to turn the microphone over to a couple of my students, or one of my students, and Maya's going to introduce the speaker and say a few words as well. After that, Dr. Etga Ugur is going to present to us his presentation on the Israel-Palestine conflict. When he's done, we're going to have an opportunity for questions. To make sure, we knew that we were going to have a larger crowd tonight, so to make sure that we can answer as many questions as possible, we're going to use a system of note cards. And so when you came in to sit down, there was a card on your chair. Hopefully, between you or your friend, you can find a pen as well. But if you have a question that occurs to you during the presentation, we'd ask that you write it down on the card. And then immediately after the presentation, some Model UN students are going to be around the outsides of the rows, and hopefully we can pass the cards down to the end. And then at that point, Dr. John Lucas from Pierce College is going to be here, and he's going to sort through the cards and try to make sure that we get the light questions are sort of lumped together so that we can really see how we can get a lot of questions answered during that Q&A period. While Dr. Lucas is going through the cards, a couple of Model UN students are going to ask questions to kind of fill that time. And then after that, we're going to have Dr. Ugur answer questions that John Lucas is going to present that are from you. After that period of time, Dr. Ugur has asked for some live Q&A. So if at that point any other questions have come up, we'll have a couple of folks, Maya and Anna will be running around with wireless microphones to make sure that if you have any other questions, that you can get those answered. We'd like to be done by 8:15. It's a school night, and a lot of students are here, and just be sensitive to everybody's time. So 8:15 will be sort of we'll be finished at that point. I think that's it. So I'm really, really pleased to see so many people. Welcome to our campus, and I want to turn it over now to somebody I have a lot of respect for. We have a community affairs team that partners with the World Affairs Council. You'll see one at the beginning and then her partner at the end. But this is Maya Kratley.
Hello, my name is Maya Kratley, and I am the co-chair of Community Affairs for Bellarmine Model UN. I would just like to echo Mr. Brown's sentiments in saying that Bellarmine is really lucky in that we have an academic environment that prioritizes asking questions and having these difficult conversations. And we really invite all of you here tonight to have a discussion on civility and really just kind of expose ourselves and learn more about the history of this conflict. So thank you for being here tonight. I would also like to thank our partnership with the World Affairs Council of Tacoma, which would not be possible without the grant support from Tacoma Creates. So thank you so much for that. And now I would love you to join me in welcoming Dr. Ugur, Dr. Ugr's remarks will offer a political and historical context to the most recent episode of war and humanitarian crisis in Israel-Palestine. He will discuss the roots, evolution, and political dynamics of this conflict with a focus on the roles played by key regional forces and actors in the Middle East. We are pleased this evening to welcome Dr. Etga Ugur, who is an associate professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma, where he teaches classes on comparative politics, American foreign policy, Middle East politics, and Middle East politics. Dr. Ugur's research interests include religion and politics in the Middle East, Islamic movements, Turkish politics, and comparative government. He is the author of Faith and Politics in the Public Sphere. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Etga Ugur.
Good evening. Can you hear me? No. I need to raise this a little bit. How is it now? Good? All right. Good to see everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm thankful for World Affairs Council Tacoma and Bellarmine Prep for organizing this event and inviting me here. And I'm also very thankful for so many people turning today, this evening. Since we gave you cards to write, maybe I can give you a map quiz. Does everybody know which these countries are on the map? Because we're going to be talking about them. So make sure to test your geographic knowledge before we start. I'd like to start off with a little bit of a check-in and sort of think about what we're bringing to this talk. I normally would like to have more of an interactive conversation about issues like this. But even if we can have, a really well-structured conversation, maybe we can start some internal conversation, I thought. What brings us here tonight? Do we have strong feelings about what has been going on? Do we have personal connections, associations with the region, with the countries, with the people? Do we have very firm opinions that we're really convinced? Do we have maybe some curiosity about some aspect, some dimension of the conflict? I want you to think for a moment, what are you confident that you know about this conflict? And is there one thing that maybe you're aware that you don't know? You could learn a little bit more, maybe something puzzling. Something doesn't quite add up after hearing all the news and maybe reading about them, hearing people speak. And maybe also do a brief empathy exercise, right? Ultimately, when we are talking about politics, we are talking about people, right? We are talking about people whose lives have been really turned upside down, to say the least. Try to think about people who lost their loved ones. Maybe they didn't hear from them for a long time. They had to hide inside, a building, not knowing what's going on, how to survive. Maybe they still have people who are hostages. Think about maybe children, families who have to ration their foods. Right? Think about people, in some cases, entire families die, right? An entire generation, 2 generations. Imagine going through medical operations without anesthesia, right? Imagine you're coming to a point where you don't know where to go. You have been so much, you have changed so many places, right? So I think when we start thinking about them, we do perhaps appreciate that this is really a conflict that really touches deeply, right, to people's lives. And this is just one episode, the most recent episode, right? That's what makes it so tragic. But we need to understand, right? We need to understand so that maybe we can respond better, so that we can process these things better. So I don't want to be insensitive to the emotions people bring. I don't want to be insensitive to the human suffering that has been going on by offering you, these analytical bits of politics and history here, right? So I want to put it out there at the very beginning that this is really a deeply emotional, deeply emotional issue, and it should be a deeply emotional issue. And let's not also forget that we are all part of a community here, and sometimes, making eye contact with people around us also reminds us that, right, we are all part of a community here. That was for you. Now, why am I here? Like many of you, I do really care about this issue, and I was deeply shocked when October 7th attacks happened, and the aftermath of October 7th and the devastating war that has been going on for more than 125 days now. It's a third of a year, right? It has been a long time. So I have a lot of disappointment, a lot of frustrations, and I also have curiosity, right? I mean, there are things that can be done, but they have not been done to address a lot of the suffering, right? I mean, there are these parameters of how could a two-state solution could work, right? By and large, a lot of people would agree these will be some workable solutions, but we can't get there. And more importantly, we have been moving away from that kind of a resolution. And I am curious, right? Why we can't, and what can we do to perhaps change the course of some of these developments? I'm also here because I am concerned that sometimes people feel the need to deny the emotions, feelings, and suffering of others to sort of get their point across and to justify their positions. I'm here also because I don't like to hear some of these cliches that, oh, there are two sides, or it's just complicated. Oh, they have always been fighting. Middle East has always had conflict. I think we really need to go beyond some of these cliches that we heard after every major event that included the Middle East, right? And of course, personally, I always benefit from speaking engagements. I think about things that I haven't thought before, and I think we have quite a bit of teachers in the room. They all know that the best way to learn is to present something, to teach. So I will probably have some benefit from that part of it as well. But I think ultimately I'm really hopeful that we may collectively think about this issue, which I think also reflects upon our values. It reflects upon our humanity to have that kind of, I think, self-conversation and collective thinking. And maybe, right, maybe we will realize things, we will learn things, question things, and we may even be inspired to take action to make a difference. So October 7th, 2022, right? It's a surprise attack that kills more than 1,200 Israelis in more than 20 kibbutzim, small towns. People in the music festival get also targeted. And then you have more than 200 hostages, some of which were released a few months ago, and some of them still remain as hostages. By most accounts, this is Israel's most tragic calamity, and also the manner and nature of some of the attacks, mutilation of bodies, sexual violence. These have made it quite a traumatic experience for the Israeli society. It's also a failure of the high-tech Israeli intelligence and military establishment and the government, and the whole idea, the whole approach to the so-called conflict management. We can manage Gaza, keeping more than 2 million people largely under a blockade for so many years. In a way, it's a catastrophic success for Hamas, right? I think they did not expect to be able to infiltrate in so many big numbers and very much attack so many people with very little resistance. And perhaps that has also a lot of bearing, right, on the future of Hamas and also Palestinian politics. But of course, the people in Gaza, I mean, more than now 26,000, I believe, people are estimated to have been killed. A huge number of them women and children, right? I mean, it is just a staggering number. I mean, 1,200 is staggering, but every day we kind of get desensitized about the numbers. 26,000 people. That's a huge number, and it's still going on. There's still, I mean, there are some, I guess, negotiations about the ceasefire, etc. It's not in sight that there is relief. We still can't manage to send humanitarian aid to these populations, right? It's just a very dire, catastrophic, tragic turn of events. What's at stake? Some stakes, there are some efforts perhaps to minimize or deny some of the atrocities that happened on October 7th. There is also a lot of dehumanizing language that comes from the Israeli government, particularly officials, right? And there are dire questions about ethnic cleansing, genocide, humanitarian law violations, war crimes, some of which have already made their way, right, to international bodies, like International Court of Justice. So we do have a lot at stake. We have a lot at stake in terms of the ability of the international community to respond, right? I have already mentioned the humanitarian catastrophe that has been taking place right before our eyes. On the policy side, there are lots of questions about the end game for the Israeli government. The sort of political dynamics and calculations that may perhaps motivate Israeli government not to commit to any kind of ending perhaps agreement about the post-war event, post-war arrangements. And we do know that it's not going to be Israel that's going to rebuild Gaza, so it's going to take a lot of international cooperation to respond, right, to mobilize. We are in the United States. There is a lot at stake for United States as well, for what the United States stands for, its values, but also its position, its influence in the region. And so its priorities have been quite significantly challenged. There are, as you know, credible fears of regional escalation. At this point, it's between United States and Iran sort of fighting over proxies on third country soil, on Syria, in Iraq, around Yemen. But there is danger, right, for escalation. And also, we cannot deny that a low-intensity conflict, regional war, is already happening. When we talk about Iranian proxies, again, there is sort of a language that kind of dismisses the true nature of what's going on. What's the context of the October 7th events? How did we get here? I think we can look at first the Biden administration, and the most telling statement came from the administration's, the president's national security advisor, Andrew Sullivan, right? He, quote unquote, said, the region is quieter than it has been for decades. This was actually part of an essay he published for the Foreign Affairs magazine. In the original version, it exists, but they took it out from the online version after October 7th. So this tells you, right, the sort of short-sightedness and getting the priorities wrong. There was this belief that you can just ignore Palestine and push for this Arab-Israeli normalization. And you will make some gestures for Palestinians that will sort of appease Arab publics in these countries, and then you will give certain benefits, security guarantees, perhaps share some possibly civilian nuclear technology with countries like Saudi Arabia in return for making peace, right? A peace which we should say is not a real peace. The countries that already established the peace is a cold peace. Their publics did never support that peace because the Palestinian issue has not been addressed, right? As much as people would like to sort of bypass and go around, the Palestinian issue still matters quite deeply for the publics in the region. Netanyahu government and its right-wing extremist settler, pro-settler coalition partners, right, have been getting a lot of concessions. They have been tolerated about increasing settlements, settlers using violence, intimidation against Palestinians in West Bank, and with a lot of impunity. And the Netanyahu government really felt like they could manage this conflict. So they used the approach of so-called mowing the lawn approach. Every few years you deal with them. And then also, while Netanyahu is going to have a lot of hard talk about Hamas, he was the one who actually propped up Hamas through Qatar by enabling the funding so that there is no real hope for a Palestinian statehood. The Palestinian Authority is delegitimized, undermined, and Hamas is sort of the part of the divide and rule policy, which has been a pattern for much of post-1948 Israeli policies towards Palestinians. And then one other word, right? We hear about these groups who are threatening Israel, or they are talking about being the resistance force. They also have their own interests. And what ends up happening here is really the Palestinian cause is often tokenized, instrumentalized. While people talk about Palestine, they actually have other calculations. So that's the context, right? The regional context. And I was saying earlier, while it was a surprise attack, was it really that unprecedented? Let me give you some details from the attack and make a connection from another historical episode. So the attackers, when they crossed the border or the barriers from Gaza side, they shouted, "This is our land." Right? The military leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, who's credited for being the mastermind for the attacks, reportedly considered it as an act of resistance. Right? Who's Yahya Sinwar? He was born to a family that was forced out of the Palestinian town of Al-Nejal. Now it's an Israeli town called Ashkelon. Right? He spent 22 years in different Israeli prisons. And he has reportedly have told his cellmates that he wants to defeat Israel so that his family can return to its village. Those kind of personal connections are actually pretty common, that you can hear people still keeping the keys of the houses that their families they took with them when they had to flee, right, with the hope of going back one day, right? So you have this personal connection, and so the magnitude is unprecedented, absolutely. But the type of attacks, they have precedence. I'll bring you, I'll take you back to 1956, April 1956. This is taking place in Nahal Oz, a newly established kibbutz near the Gaza Strip border. A 21-year-old Israeli, Roy Rothberg, was murdered by Palestinians while he was patrolling the fields. His body gets dragged across the border, mutilated, and much like October 7th, that was a nationwide shock and anger among Israelis. Moshe Dayan, who is the IDF chief, right? He gave a eulogy at the funeral, which is unthinkable today. This is what he said: "Let us not cast the blame where they and their fathers developed dealt into our state. So Dayan was referring to people like Sinwar, right? Yahya Sinwar. Those people who went to refugee camps in Gaza, some of which you may have heard in the news, got hit during the war, and not only they had to leave, but their towns, right, got transformed, and they have, in many cases, people living in the very houses they used to. Right? You have these kind of many stories. Was Dayan a supporter of Palestinian cause? No, he's not. I mean, in fact, he's one of the generals who was in charge of the displacement. But he was cognizant of what many Israelis didn't seem to accept, which is that Palestinians will never forget what happened, right, in 1948. The Nakba is not something that will disappear from the individual or the collective mind. So this is how he addressed, right, this issue. This is Dayan's words again. This is our life's choice, to be prepared and armed, strong and determined. Lest the sword be stricken from our fist and our lives cut down. So the Zionists, they were quite aware that there was no way the Palestinian inhabitants, the Arab Palestinians, would accept, right, the Zionist project willingly, courteously in some of the codes. People talk about Herzl, Theodor Herzl, who's the founding father, ideologue of Zionism, right, and how he made arguments on the basis of bringing the technology and modernization of Europe, sort of a version of, right, the civilizing effect of the European science and technology. He does have some of these statements in one of the novels. For example, he talks about how maybe a character like Rashid Bey is going to say, why should we not like, right, the Jewish brothers coming, because they are bringing, right, better farming techniques, so they're helping us in the economic realm. But I think it's really not accurate to say that the Zionist leadership were ignorant about the Palestinians who already live there. This idea that there is a land without people for people without land is a slogan that's meant to convince the Jews of Europe, primarily perhaps even the United States, to come, right, and be part of the Zionist project, which is about establishing a homeland for Jews, right, where Jews have the sovereignty and their own national institutions. There are examples of letter exchanges between the Palestinian prominent leaders, like the mayor of Jerusalem, Yusuf Dia Khalidi. There are letter exchanges between him and Theodor Herzl about that, yes, you want to establish a state here, but there are already people who are here, and they have been here for a very long time. If you look at some of the writings and discussions that happens within the Zionist world, so Zionists obviously had their own differences. You had more the revisionist Zionists who are on the more right wing of the movement. You have more of the labor Zionists who are on the left. If you look at a person like Jabotinsky, who quote unquote, said, I don't know of a single example in history where a country was colonized with the courteous consent of the native population. And David Ben-Gurion, who becomes the first prime minister, the most important probably leader of Zionist movement, agreed. There is no solution to the question of relations between Arabs and Jews, and we must recognize this situation. We as a nation want this country to be ours. The Arabs as a nation want this country to be theirs. And similar dynamics played out in other cases where Europeans, right, tried to establish states in heavily populated non-European countries like Rhodesia, South Africa, and French Algeria. So I'm just suggesting here, I think the real question is really not why Arabs refuse to accept what happened, right, in Palestine. But the Zionist leaders, knowing full well, anticipating, why didn't they look for perhaps ways to find a way to negotiate a solution, right? And there are many missed, denied opportunities from Jordanian kings, many offers about, especially to go back to pre-1967 borders, perhaps integrate parts of it as a federated Jordanian state. You have internationally engaged plans, the four power plans, Sadat's peace offer in 1970s. 1973 war itself, by most accounts, is a way for Egypt to negotiate or push Israel to negotiate with the Arab countries. So there is this myth that Arabs and Palestinians were never serious about negotiating. I can give you many examples. It's a partial list here. Even PLO, which started off as obviously a military movement for Palestinian national independence, gradually changed, right, its approach to political liberation, ultimately accepted Israel's right to exist, yet there is still no Palestinian state. Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, they have came up with plans on the basis of peace for land for peace agreements, right? These overall initiatives endorsed by Arab League at least twice in 2007 and 2017. The reason why, right, Israel has been so reluctant and obstructive about any proper settlement has something to do with the so-called iron wall strategy, right? The same person I was referring to, Jabotinsky, right, it comes up with a solution, right, to that problem of Arabs not welcoming the Zionists in Palestine. And he proposed a 5-stage plan to create this iron wall between Israel and the neighboring or surrounding Arabs, successfully defending it, making it really costly to attack Israel. So a lot of the Israeli response to Gaza kind of follows that playbook of overwhelming response, right? Disproportionate response is part of the doctrine. And the idea down the road is you break the will of the Arabs or the Palestinians, and then ultimately perhaps some moderates are going to look for negotiations, and that opening is going to lead to a negotiated settlement. Even though, right, we can say Israel probably accomplished this second stage by 1967. It hasn't really moved to the negotiations and the settlement phase, and that has a lot to do with power imbalance and domestic politics of Israel. So, I'm mindful of the time. I will try to wrap up in a few minutes. The territorial compromise was more possible in 1967. For a decade or so, there are real offers, movement, pressures from international players. But the Labour governments end up deciding not to decide. So they sort of do not make any movement, do not commit themselves for meaningful, serious negotiations. And over time, you also have a major transformation of the Israeli political scene, which brings the political right much more forcefully into the governments. And by 1990s, when Oslo peace process finally happens, right, it's a political context which is so difficult to manage for the Israeli politicians, because now you have very vocal, specific political parties who are based on increasing settlements and making sure that their understanding of Israel, the greater Israel that includes West Bank and Gaza, in some cases even beyond, right, is being pushed and at least given some concessions. So even when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, there was a lot of fear of a civil war and domestic violence among these groups. So now Israel is at a point where it's very hard. Its politics makes it very, very hard to compromise. And there is also really no reason for Israel to compromise if gradually they can increase the control. So there is now emerging belief that perhaps Israel can keep most or maybe even all of the occupied territories, West Bank and Gaza, change the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, etc. So it becomes much less possible, to push, have leverage, over Israel to change things. I'm just going to mention here a few things, and then I will open it up for questions. So if there are questions about these, I can always come back to them. I want to hear your questions and thoughts as well. One of the key problems then is, there is really no internal dynamic within Israel to push for this kind of a change. Israel is in a position of power, and it has often been the international actors, the preeminent powers, whether it's Britain or United States, Soviet Union during the Cold War, that put some limits, to Israel's relations with its neighbors. There has not been a regional order or a security architecture that would be conducive to sort of have more, organic local regional solutions, because the region has been, dealing with this outside interference. Many countries are at the same time going through their own nation-state building. Those kind of simultaneous pressures made it quite difficult to have a good, conducive regional political environment. Prognosis, it's not very positive. I would say since the collapse of the Oslo peace process, in 2000, the beginning of the second Intifada, the conditions are so that talking about the two-state solution is really not meaningful anymore. There were times, as I was saying earlier, 1960s, 70s, that there was a real chance for coming to a negotiated solution. But the reality is people in Israel, in West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, they live under Israeli sovereignty. In some way, shape or form, under different conditions, regulations. And the increase of settlements, the lack of political will, it makes it quite unlikely to have a two-state solution that you hear a lot from the policy pundits and the two-state solution industry, if you will. The reality is you have a one-state reality, and I think the challenge is going to be to make this a one state that recognizes equal rights, ensures civil rights for everybody, rather than having layers and classes of citizenship or residence across different parts of the country. I guess I'll finish with a joke. So it's reported that Pope John Paul II said that there are two possible solutions for the conflict. It's a miraculous and a realistic solution, and the two sides coming together and solving it is the miraculous one, and divine intervention is the more realistic one. And for those of us who believe in divine intervention, it doesn't always happen in a positive way. So, I will just say that the history, the regional dynamics, the global powers, their relationship has not been kind to Palestinians. And I would also say the power imbalance and the success of the Iron Wall strategy did not serve the Israelis as well. And this idea that you can ignore, bypass Palestine and just find some other ways of creating peace and stability in the region is, I think, quite misguided. So I would say there is no really healing for the Middle East without healing Palestine. And I will stop here and look forward to questions.
If that's okay, I would love to ask the first question. So you mentioned at the beginning that there were a lot of cliches that you didn't like being associated with when we're talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. So especially as young people that are engaging in discussions on this issue in class on a regular basis, are there any ideals or things that we should keep in mind when we're talking about this issue to avoid those cliches, but also really talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict in a holistic way?
Yeah, it can be quite challenging to have conversation about hot topic issues, controversial issues. I guess what I was getting at with that idea of too complicated and there are two sides question is that's a way to avoid real conversations. It should not be complicated to really condemn what happened on October 7th. It should not be complicated to criticize Israeli government's war in Gaza and the humanitarian catastrophe, right? That's what I'm trying to get at here, right? Sometimes we just try to be, I guess, too politically correct. We don't want to, disturb different sort of things around, so we don't really engage with them the way we should. There are sometimes really no complicated. There are more complication in some of those issues. We will need to be able to take a clear, proper position. That's what I was.
Thank you so much. So we're going to start off doing questions just from Bellarmine students, and then if you have a question on the card, if you could pass it to the end of your rows on the side that's easily accessible, and then our Model UN students will also be helping collect all of those. And if you need a pen, we'll also be passing out some more pens. So, next question.
Hi, and thank you again so much for being here. My question is that this is a really tough and emotional topic, and it takes a lot to be able to discuss things like this, especially on such a constant basis. And I really just want to know what allows you to keep having these discussions and what keeps you in this area of academia that is very emotional and it's a difficult discussion to have.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the empathy. It has not been easy. For example, I cannot watch the news. I have to read from the newspapers or online. It's just unbearable, right? So I need to probably acknowledge sometimes, being able to talk, you have to do that kind of self-care. But what I think motivates me is I'm really frustrated and disappointed that things are happening before our eyes and we know they don't have to be this way, right? And I know I can't be the only one who cares about it. And I know my students, I know my community, they are here, they care about this issue. So I guess what keeps me going is more of that positive energy and the engagement that I feel from people around. Otherwise, yeah, it can be quite depressing. Thank you for that question.
Hi. How do you feel that maybe the longer history of the region has contributed to the current situation, maybe prior to the 19th century and just to the dawn of civilization? How is this stability and instability in the region, maybe in the traditions that we've seen, affected the current situation?
Yeah, I think we are used to assuming the Middle East has been really the more unstable part of the world, but that's really a case that happens in 20th century, right? While Europe is going through its dark ages, it's really the golden age for the Arab civilization. A lot of scientific, technological developments happen from whether it's the Abbasid Empire or the Umayyad Empire or the later other non-Arab empires. So that is, I think, a very different historical picture. And what does start to change things in the region is really advent of modernization. Modernization in terms of the printing press, increased literacy rates, urbanization, the region becoming sort of part of the global economic system, starting to produce cash crops to European markets, the European involvement on the pretext of protection of minorities does also bring a lot of that modernization to the region. You have missionary schools, French or American. A lot of the people in the region, they go to these schools. They become sort of a way for upward mobility, and then there is rise of consciousness about, for example, Arab identity. You have the Arab Renaissance that happens in 19th century through, again, societies, public discussions, print media. You have a rise of Arab Renaissance, and the Ottoman Empire, which rules over Palestine and much of the Middle East, is going through its own maybe defensive modernization. And right before the First World War, right, the young Turks in the Ottoman Empire come to power. They, promise, freedom and end to despotism, but they in turn they themselves become despotic and authoritarian, and their sort of policies, top-down Turkification policies, they become problematic for Arabs. And during this period, you have sort of a rise of consciousness about collective Arab identity, Syrian identity, Palestinian identity. So I will say, this is a time that modernization along these different dimensions is creating a context, right, in which you have new ways, new developments, and ultimately, after the First World War, the expectation is that these Arab peoples are going to have their own independent polities, and those settlements do not necessarily meet those expectations. And so what you have is a struggle, a power struggle, a struggle for building institutions, and that does bring a lot of that, what you may say, instability.
So I think, okay, all right. So I have some questions from the audience here, and the first question, because you were talking about the Nakba, somebody in the audience had a question about the Jews who were expelled from Arab countries in 1948. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Thank you very much for that question. I actually had a slide, I didn't get to it. And this is something that is quite often underappreciated, that there were other disaffected populations, Jewish populations, in the Middle East. And countries like Morocco, Iraq, they had huge number of Jewish populations who lived in these countries for many, many years, whether it's Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews. You may know about the Sephardic Jews being admitted to the Ottoman Empire towards the end of 15th century, when the Reconquista happens in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula. So there is a presence of Jewish populations who are part of life, who are part of these countries' communities. And after 1948, partly due to rise of Arab nationalism in these countries, but also partly due to pressures from United States, pressures from Israel, through sometimes false flag operations, like in Egypt, in Iraq. This is a book written by a prominent Arab Jewish scholar, Avi Shulaim, who talks about the history of his family. He's from Iraq, and then his family is forced to migrate to Israel after 1948 and 1950s. And he talks about some of these bombings that there is good evidence that they may have been actually orchestrated by Mossad to put pressure on the Jewish populations to leave. I mean, it's not always false flag operations. Some of the fears and tensions were real. But ultimately what happens is these communities who live there, who belonged in those countries, right? They were taken apart. And their experience in Israel was not always also very positive. The Ashkenazi dominance of the Zionist elite created conditions that made a lot of these Arab Jews as sort of the secondary discriminated against. They did not fit the so-called Sabra ideal Israeli citizenship. And I think perhaps one more impact, regional impact, is these countries like Iraq and Morocco and Turkey, because of these exchanges, because of these expulsions or migrations, they became impoverished. And perhaps their democracies were, or their plight for democracy were affected by these developments, right? Homogenization of populations, lack of minorities, I think, and also loss of a lot of the skilled human capital and financial capital perhaps made some of these states more oppressive than they could have been. So I think there is a lot of things to be said about the Jewish populations who had to migrate from Arab countries or countries in the region. That's an excellent question.
All right, thank you, Edgar. We have a lot of really interesting questions about the impact of the international community, so let me just give you three and then you can pick.
Okay.
So how does international support, specifically US, UK, or lack of support, influence any ability to negotiate a solution? Somebody asked about the economic dynamics, which would encourage Israel to grant Palestinian civil liberties. And someone else asked, we sometimes hear that Israel could not pursue its current approaches without US military aid. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, I think it will be just doing disservice to say United States doesn't have leverage over Israel, given that how much United States have been contributing in terms of aid, military support, diplomatic support, political support at the UN international institutions. So I would say United States should be in a position of, I think, more strength. I sometimes hear this idea that maybe we are whispering to the ears of Netanyahu government without publicly, embarrassing them, etc. It doesn't seem to be working very well. So, I think we need to be more demanding of our government in terms of where the military aid is going and how it's being used. I mean, the government, the Biden administration has been incredibly dismissive of the, for example, ICJ proceedings, which found that there was plausible, finding for genocide, did not dismiss, right, the South African case. And the United States giving military aid to Israel can put the United States in a position of complicity in such dire accusations, right? So I think international community, United States need to take this more seriously. In terms of economic part of it, I think economic empowerment is key, but if the idea is that is going to sort of kill the political identity of the Palestinians, I don't think that's really going to happen. There was this Trump plan, for example, that offered a lot of money and economic opportunities in return for a Palestinian acceptance of much, much less than acceptable statehood. So in that sense, I think, of course, more economic aid is necessary. We are talking about giving a lot of, incentives, but when it comes to actually doing the bare minimum responsibilities, like continuing the contribution to the UNRWA, the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, that's in charge of offering help to Palestinians. You're just too quick. In a time of humanitarian crisis, you're just cutting the funding for it so quick.
There's a reason for that. It's not, don't be so dismissive of that. There's a reason for the funds being cut, not just by the United States, but by multiple countries. And the International Court of Justice did not come up with findings that supported genocide. They didn't. It's just they didn't.
Well, I hear what I hear what you're saying. I think you probably want to go through the microphone, but I'm going to address what you're saying. Israel gave a dossier of, I don't know, 12 people who are accused of either participating or being complicit in the attacks, right? I mean, I think that's serious. And it shows that the agency took the accusations seriously and they fired or suspended these people. But is it really necessary to threaten cutting the funds when it's 12 people out of I don't know how many thousands of people working there? So yes, I do hear there is a reason for it, but is it really proportionate to the accusations? That's one. Two, I also find the timing a little bit convenient that it came right after the ICJ ruling. Because like the day after ICJ ruling, Israel came up with these accusations. And on the question of the ICJ ruling, I'm not an international law expert, but I will say it did not dismiss the case. Of course, it's not a finding, a final finding. It will take probably years to actually do it, but I think the court, its decision mentioned the plausibility of the genocide allegations, and basically asked a number of, requested or required a number of conditions to meet the needs of the populations, right? So it said, do not, right, come close to acts that would violate the genocide convention. So it may be limited, it may not have called for a ceasefire, but I think it was important in that sense that it was not dismissed. And people may disagree about the interpretations of it. It will take time. So yeah, I mean, I think usually the states, they claim victory regardless of some of the outcomes from these international proceedings.
Okay, so we're almost at 8:15, so just we'll have one last question. So this question was about the question of the Palestinian refugees, and they were wondering whether it would be a solution to have them absorbed by the other Middle Eastern countries neighboring, such as Egypt and Jordan.
I don't think that will be a solution. I mean, I understand some people offer this as like a real, from a sincere care about these populations. But the implications and the historical precedent, right, that when people leave, when they are expelled, right, they can never come back. So the fear for Palestinians and frankly most people in the region is this will be another, phase, episode of ethnic cleansing, and they will never go back. And also, a lot of these countries have quite limited resources. And we're not talking about really rich countries when we're talking about Egypt taking some of these people, right? And then I think one other issue with that is the assumption that, well, all Arabs are kind of the same. The Egyptians should, Palestinians should just go to Egypt. They can just go to Jordan and Syria. Why not to the Gulf? Like there is no difference between them. So I will say part of it is, I think people sometimes say it from good intentions, but as you may have heard, many countries in the region, they have been resisting any form of proposal that would, say, lead to the Gazans, going to Sinai, for example, or being taken to other countries, because there seems to be just a way to basically get rid of Palestinian people who have been doing their best to really actually stay in their land. And that's kind of, they became strongly, right, attached to the struggle. So I think we will hear.
so much for that fascinating talk. We really enjoyed hearing your insightful perspective. Your talk has not only educated everyone, but definitely also sparked some meaningful conversations among us. Also, a huge thank you to all of you guys for coming out to Bellarmine on a Thursday night and making this conversation possible. And finally, on behalf of the Bellarmine UN program, I would like to extend gratitude to the World Affairs Council of Tacoma, along with Tacoma Creates, for partnering with us and making this event possible. So for future events, both at Bellarmine and other venues, be sure to check out Bellarmine Model UN social medias or the WACT website. Again, thank you guys so much for coming and have a great night.